Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for starting your weekend with us. It's incredibly fortuitous timing with two fabulous experts on the subject. I say fortuitous timing because President Trump finished his short speech on China in time for us to all log on to this webinar. So it's good timing from that perspective. One administrative point, which is if you want to ask a question during this afternoon's program, please do so by clicking the Q&A icon located at the bottom of your screen and type out your question. Please be sure to include your name and affiliation, because I don't love these anonymous questions. I want to know who's asking the question. You've received our speakers' bios, and they can be, they're found on our event page of our website. So let me just briefly introduce our speakers. Most importantly, they are both members of the National Committee's Public Intellectuals Program. And the program is designed to get them to do precisely what they're doing today. So I thank both of you for doing this. Jude is the Freeman Chair of China Studies at CSIS in DC. He's also a senior advisor at Crumpton Group, which is a geopolitical risk advisory firm based in Arlington, Virginia. He's also an adjunct fellow of the Asia Pacific Security Program at Center for New American Security. Sun Yun is a senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia Program and director of the China program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Both of them are sought after for their expertise in this period when expertise on China in the not-for-profit sector is still there, in the government it's interesting how much is still there. But first, before starting what we had planned for the program, President Trump has just completed this tirade against China with somewhat limited facts on policy prescriptions on what's going to happen. So let me both ask Jude and Sun Yun to kind of comment on that before we go into the Liang Hui, before the results of the two sessions that just concluded. Jude.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be doing this, and especially with Sun Yun. So I really appreciate the opportunity. Having just come fresh from watching this this press conference, a couple thoughts. I mean, my first thought is we should all expect, and I think we already were expecting, but clearly U.S.-China relations to continue in an incredibly dark direction, because the underlying tone of the president's remarks, I think, were incredibly dire, direct, and looking forward to the election in November. I think this indicates the tone that the administration is going to adopt as it's in election mode. I was just writing notes for phrases that stuck out to me. One of them is clearly this idea of, he said, the cover up of the Wuhan virus. So we're going to be back again to the name and shame of the virus, and the origin story is obviously going to continue to play a key role here, and as the administration moves forward. Another phrase that stuck out to me, and this is not a surprise, but indicates the now near permanence of this idea of decoupling, is the president said, as we reshore our supply chains, we need to be going towards, quote, economic independence, which is a pretty radical idea in an era where globalization and interconnectedness has brought so much prosperity and national strength to the United States. This is a very radical vision, I should say. And it was just slipped in here in between some announcements of completely walking away from the WHO. But I think these are important things to watch, because the economic cost to the United States from even moving towards economic independence is pretty significant. On the Hong Kong issue, and again, you and I were going back and forth over email before we came on, I think we're all scratching our heads to figure out exactly what was just said here. It was clearly a very direct message saying we're now done treating Hong Kong the way we used to under US law. But the second part of it is, here's what's going to change. And I have to say, outside of the top line announcements of export controls, sanctions, I'm still not sure exactly what this will look like, because Trump gave himself some wiggle room by saying with limited exceptions or with some exceptions. And of course, exactly what those are is going to be really important. So now we're just going to have to wait for probably Treasury and State to come out with more specific statements about what exactly this will look like. But final point here, this now in retrospect, this is what I guess we should have expected, which is a very quote unquote strong statement that is a quote unquote response, but yet hasn't exactly done anything. And so we'll now have to wait to see exactly what it is that the Trump administration will do. And clearly this gives them some wiggle room here of exactly what measures they're going to deploy. And I'll show.
Thank you, Steve. It's an honor to be on this program with Jude. On the statement that President Trump just made, I'm trying to gauge how the Chinese will perceive this statement and how they will react to it. I think Beijing has fully expected that US will remove Hong Kong's special trading status based on the national security law. In fact, I think that decision is even on some level welcomed by people in Beijing, because removing Hong Kong's special trading status will damage Hong Kong's economy and diminish its role as an international financial center. However, other than the damage that the decision will inflict upon US economic interests and the interests of US companies, it will also serve to deplete Hong Kong and Hong Kong people of the international attention, their economic privileges, and the political support that they have enjoyed so far. So literally, this is turning Hong Kong into just another city, and that's exactly what Beijing had wanted. Hong Kong is just another Chinese city. So therefore, I suspect in Beijing's calculation, the economic cost of the removal of the special status of Hong Kong will be carried by many, but the political benefits will be enjoyed by Beijing alone. So in addition, forcing the US to remove Hong Kong's special trading status will also remove Washington's ability to hold Beijing hostage to the issue. So other than the sanctions that we have heard about, such as on Chinese officials or on Chinese entities, I think those sanctions in the Chinese perception have lost their deterrence power over Beijing due to the constant and exhaustive use of them in the past 3.5 years. So I don't think that this decision would come as a surprise, and I don't think it has exceeded Beijing's original expectation as for what Washington would do. Thank you.
Just one quick, do you think there's enough sophistication in this policy? Again, it was clear the policy was literally agreed upon in the moments, or the announcement of what was going to be said was agreed upon in the moments leading up to the speech. That the speech running, was 15 minutes late was because they were still debating what was going on. Is there a certain level of sophistication where they're hoping that, what we have is an NPC, basically authorization for the standing committee to write a law? Is it so sophisticated? You say, gosh, if you write a law that isn't so bad, we won't enact a lot of these things. Or am I just kind of being overly optimistic?
I think that was just in the past couple of days discussions I've been having with folks. I think that was one of the ideas is, look, there's no way we're going to be able to get Beijing to withdraw from moving forward with the law. So there's really only two pressure points or areas where you could conceivably influence: the text, the drafting of the law, and then how they might be interpreting it. That second one felt like a long shot. So it was really just this idea of possibly we can now, we come out with our opening gambit, which is we've now put all the pieces on the table just now, saying, look, we're willing to do all this up to and including sanctions, but we're not exactly going to announce what it is yet. And now it's a counter move to try to get Beijing to affect its drafting. But I don't know, but Yoon thinks about this. I think Beijing's going to draft the law as Beijing's going to draft the law. I think this is a domestic issue for them. This is hardliners in Beijing who are going to write this law because they see a significant problem down there. And I think we're overestimating the leverage we have here in the United States if we think we're going to be able to get into the drafting room of the NPC Standing Committee to get them to strike passages or rewrite them. But I could be wrong on that.
Yeah. Sun-Yun?
Well, Zhang Ye only announced this national security legislation on Hong Kong on the evening of May 21st in Beijing, before the two sessions actually began. So that basically leaves the United States 8 days to react to this announcement. And like Jude said, we don't know what it looks like. We roughly know that they're going to target 4 types of activities: secession, subversion, terrorism, and external interference in Hong Kong. But what the law will look like, and more importantly, what the law enforcement will look like. I think that's a bigger question here. We can react to the law, but the law actually in the end will have to be enforced on the ground in Hong Kong by some security agencies that we don't know who will be in charge of. So I think those details are not yet revealed. And I think US is in a difficult place to calculate the risk and the benefits between punishing Hong Kong for something that Hong Kong didn't really do, and punishing China, which is really charting the course on the national security law. And it's very difficult to separate those two.
I think Jude is absolutely right that our ability to influence this law, given the relationship that exists between the drafting of the law, given the relationship that exists between the United States and China, is extremely low. Who can actually influence the drafting of the law, though, are the pro-Beijing legislators in Hong Kong, that they actually do have an ability to affect what that law looks like, to affect kind of the things Sun-Yun is talking about, what kind of agencies are going to have, what their enforcement power, are they going to operate through the Hong Kong police? Are they going to be able to actually enforce themselves? These are all open questions and would have enormous effects on how Hong Kong exists in the future. In a conversation I had with a I can't say who it was, but a fairly prominent person from Hong Kong, they said, we hope the United States stands back and just doesn't do anything, because any participation through the United States will make it worse for the people of Hong Kong, which was a very interesting statement.
Yeah, just one quick thought there. But of course, you have many on the protest side and the activist side who feel a sense of desperation, and are one of the reasons they've thrown up this Hail Mary of trying to draw the United States in is because they recognize without some sort of external force or pressuring Beijing that all is lost here. So I think that makes sense what you heard as well, but I think there's a pretty widespread amount of support for the U.S. getting involved here. I think Sun-Yun's absolutely right, though, about the threading that needle of how do you quote unquote punish Beijing without wrecking the Hong Kong economy. It's difficult, and just my own personal opinion, I think you could put sanctions on the table because that gives you a bit more of a scalpel here to inflict punishment. Messing with Hong Kong's economic status, though, always seemed to me to be the last resort, because the consequences are likely to be so dire, and they're going to be borne by the people of Hong Kong, not by the U.S. government. But it seems that the government has already, in many ways, made that decision.
Our government.
Our government. Sorry, yes, our government
Yeah.
has made that decision.
Yeah, certainly the politicians in Beijing are saying, life will go on as normal. This is if you're not a terrorist, a separatist, But obviously, I think, as I said in a program, one man's protest is another man's subversion.
I mean, I don't want to drone on about this, but Beijing liked having Hong Kong be Hong Kong. I don't think Beijing was necessarily looking for Hong Kong to lose the special status, which being a Chinese city outside of domestic Chinese law afforded it. And certainly the role Hong Kong has played for just senior elite in Beijing over the past several decades of facilitating transfers of ill-begotten and legally begotten wealth is very important. So I maybe somewhat disagree on I don't think Beijing wanted this, at least not now and on this timing, because Hong Kong is a pretty good piggy bank, or facilitation of a piggy bank for a lot of elite in the mainland. But if it's happening, I think now they're just going to adjust, and they're not going to be crying for too long over this.
So I agree with Jude. They did not want it. You agree with that? They were pushed into it by basically 12 months of Hong Kong being frozen, people crying independence, you know, this basically Hong Kong not functioning. That they really do perceive it that way, and they were pushed into it.
Well, I think without what happened last year, Beijing probably would have preferred it the way that you and Jude have described. But I think after the turbulence last year, after witnessing that Beijing's policy basically has no future in Hong Kong, and the more they let this fester and the longer the wait, the worse the issue is going to become. So I would say Beijing made a calculated decision. They understand the risks. They understand what the U.S. reaction in the worst shape will look like, but they also determined that this is probably the best timing to do this because U.S.-China relations currently offers Beijing no optimistic expectation over pretty much any ground. So in Beijing's calculation and based on what I have been having the conversations with Chinese, they believe that the relationship between U.S. and China has hit the rock bottom. And there's nothing Beijing can do to please U.S. either way in today's political environment anyway. Since the relationship is already in its worst shape, short of a war, now might be the best opportunity for Beijing to force on this national security law anyway. So U.S. will be critical of China regardless of what China does or doesn't do on Hong Kong. So I think that's why they perceive this as a good opportunity as any opportunity.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, I see it more that they were pushed into it by events, as you said, Sun Yun, of the last year. That they're really not doing this in the context of U.S.-China relations. They're doing it in the context of what's going on in Hong Kong. That they kept drawing red lines. So when Xi Jinping visited on the 20th anniversary of the handover, he gave a speech which laid out certain red lines, and then it gets crossed. Then they, you know, they draw these red lines and they get crossed. And now, you know, the legislature is not, you know, the 2003 failure was minor. The attempt to pass the national security law then was minor. If it were proposed today, it would fail even further. So they realize that it is not possible to get where they want to go. And the situation in Hong Kong was deteriorating. We don't agree with this. We don't think protests are a national security issue, but that's not what the leaders in Beijing think. So they were kind of, I think Jude said that pushed into it is actually it's a very good way of looking at it. But let's not spend the whole time, since people came to hear about the Liang Hui, as we were joking, as the three of us were joking, not such a joke, but it was the first time that any president of the United States has responded to anything that has gone on in the National People's Congress, at least to my knowledge. So it's quite something. And a lot went on at this NPC besides the CPCCC, besides you know, the Hong Kong legislation. So if we want to talk about some of that for a while, each of you talk for a few minutes, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we've already got a bunch of questions from the audience. So Jude, if you want to kick that off, that would be great.
Sorry, classic Zoom mistake there, talking on mute. So I think the division of labor will be, I'll talk a little bit about some of the more domestic policy focused issues here, and then Sun Yun will talk about some of the foreign policy implications. And I really, just in the interest of time, want to talk about a few of the salient narratives and policies that came out, especially from the government work report. I mean, this, to your point, Steve, we were talking about earlier on the NPC, it's not only it's the first time we've had what seems to be a direct response. I don't really remember before 2018 the NPC garnering this amount of attention, and it usually was just described as a rubber stamp, and folks in your city, Steve, would be watching to see what the growth target is, but that's really it. This changed in 2018 when we had the massive government restructuring plan, which came out of nowhere to many of us, which fundamentally rewrote much of the political system in China, as well as the relationship between the Communist Party and the government. This again was a much anticipated NPC, I think for reasons both because this was going to be a unique NPC coming off the back of a 2-month delay, China undergoing its own significant COVID-19 crisis, but also given we knew we were going to be looking to see the tone, the statements coming out of it, and what those portended for U.S.-China relations. And I think on all these fronts, it did not disappoint. A few notes on the economic front. First is the level of caution that came through from Li Keqiang's government work report. A lot of the coverage on China in COVID-19, especially after March and April, has been on the triumphalism from Beijing on an international front. But domestically, the narrative has always been from Xi Jinping and the government, look, we've made it this far, that's good, but we have a long road ahead of us. And that came through here as well. And I think the quote from Li Keqiang is, the pandemic is not over. And a lot on the economic front was targeted towards this, this idea that, look, we're making headway on some of the containment here, but our economy is in trouble. Obviously, the most notable element of this was this remarkable development of scrapping the growth target. First time this has happened since 1990. And remember the time we were in 1990 after the Tiananmen Square massacre, the economy was in shambles. That shows you the level of seriousness that Beijing is looking at the economic situation right now, and really seeing some rough waters. Given the still relative opacity of reporting, it's difficult to suss this out, but nonetheless, anecdotally and even in government documents, we're seeing that especially small to medium enterprises are really, really struggling right now. And that's why a lot of the support that Beijing has been put out during the MPC was directed towards local governments. So you both had a rising of the fiscal deficit, which is going to be injecting another 1 trillion renminbi to local governments. And then they earmarked another 1 trillion for these special government bonds for the explicit purpose of COVID-19 control. So a lot of support directed to local economies, and throughout the government work report, the idea was jobs, 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 employment protection and stability. Last 2 points, there's been this idea that has really gained prominence over the past couple months that Xi Jinping and the government have been pushing of the 6 protections. That again came through, and those are job security, people's livelihoods, security of business, food, and energy, supply chains, and sort of better functioning of lower level government. So they're looking for both protecting Chinese people's ability to be prospering and living. And again, remember, this is the year which Xi Jinping is supposed to deliver on his promise of doubling per capita GDP from its 2010 levels as part of the poverty alleviation campaign. Obviously, that's experiencing a setback, and naturally so because of COVID-19. But they are really, I think, focusing on many of the basics in these 6 protections of the Chinese economy. And the last thing I point is scrapping the growth target really does show, I think, how the government is being quite pragmatic here in how it's responding to COVID-19. And if we strip away where the space that I look at most, which is at kind of elite politics and ideology, where the story is very, very dark and depressing, you're still seeing some of the more pragmatic elements in the Chinese political system operating now and really into full gear here. And I think what comes out of the MPC to me is, although you have that higher level where there's just an extraordinary amount of party control and ideological control, they have loosened the reins a bit on sort of the subnational level to respond to this. And I think that's from an economic standpoint, I think that's quite a heartening sign. So I will pause there for the moment.
Great. Sun Yun.
Thank you, Steve. So I'll primarily focus on the foreign policy implications. We know that the 2 sessions this time did not focus primarily on the foreign policy issues, but I think because of the COVID-19, when China was indeed faced with a crossroad question, a question of choices moving forward. And when we first started to prepare for this discussion, it was before the 2 sessions, and we believed that China was facing 2 directions, and which makes this 2 session a critical conference or critical meeting to determine the future of China. There's a issue of balancing between the domestic priority and the foreign priorities such as Belt and Road, and those represent two very different directions. So in terms of the foreign policy, China has just experienced the test of the COVID-19 crisis, and what the world has witnessed as a wolf warrior diplomacy on steroid. So the question, I think, following that is that, will China stick to its assertive wolf warrior diplomacy, or it will take a more contractive policy to try to build a better relationship with the rest of the world? And like Jude pointed out, he's absolutely correct that these two sessions has primarily focused on the domestic economic development side and the guarantee of people's livelihood in China. And when we look at the work report from Li Keqiang and his press conference yesterday, most of the attention has been paid to how to stimulate growth and how to cultivate employment. And the Foreign Minister Wang Yi's press conference and most of his time had been spent on basically as what I see as propaganda to sing high praise for China's performance during the COVID-19 and how much contribution China made towards the world. So what kind of foreign policy of China should we expect after this two sessions, this Danhui? If you asked me this question 2 weeks ago, I would have a very different answer. I would be much more hopeful about the Chinese foreign policy taking a more practical, low profile, conservative or even a moderate line of foreign strategy. Especially, I'm sure people remember that when Xi Jinping visited Shanxi province on May 12th, he made a statement that caught everybody's attention. He used the words that Hu Jintao used to prioritize, which is 不折腾, which means do not create trouble for yourself. And I think that really made people hopeful, including me, that, hey, maybe we're entering a period where China will stop making trouble. But based on what we have seen, the national security law on Hong Kong during the two sessions, and the Chinese foreign policy performance on, for example, South China Sea, on Taiwan, on the border dispute with India, on the threats of trade war with Australia, and the most recent labeling Canada as the American accomplice on the issue of Meng Wanzhou, I think what we're most likely going to face following this Lianghui is an even more radical state of Chinese foreign policy. It's going to be more assertive or even more aggressive. And here's why. I think the Chinese foreign policy, of course, all the foreign policy moves are deeply related to Chinese domestic politics. I think because of COVID-19, the elite politics and political condition in China has become even more complicated than before the COVID-19. So I'm sure people have observed there had been a series of voices and events that challenged the current Chinese government and Chinese top leader during the COVID-19, questioning the Beijing's performance and Beijing's effectiveness or Beijing's failure to counter COVID-19 in the early stage. I think what that means is that the internal struggle or the internal conflicts within the Chinese political elites and that the ensuing potential instability has increased instead of decreased because of COVID-19. So therefore, I think for the Chinese top leaders, how to consolidate his authority, how to stabilize people's opinion, how to consolidate people's support of his government, the most effective way has been to divert the domestic attention. And there are two reasons for that. The first one is when the external stress on China is on the rise, it gives Beijing more room to strengthen the internal cohesiveness and the internal coherence of the Chinese people, and it will help to build what they call the internal consensus, the 内部共识, about what is the most important priority for the Chinese nation. So foreign threats do serve that purpose. And the second reason is that if we look at the record since 2013 in the South China Sea, for example, the building of the artificial islands and China's Belt and Road Initiative, this type of relatively radical and even aggressive foreign policy moves have been very effective in enhancing the authority and credibility of the Chinese leaders, especially in the Chinese leaders' internal political struggle with his political opponents. And the example that you will hear a lot from even the Chinese is that that how Xi Jinping was using the South China Sea to boost his credibility and his domestic popularity vis-a-vis his political opponents. And at the time, it was Bo Xilai, Lin Jihua, and Zhou Yongkang. So also related to the legitimacy issue or the credibility issue of the Chinese top leader is also how Chinese foreign policy will react and counter all kinds of criticisms or even condemnations on China because of COVID-19. And this is also a relatively new issue, an unprecedented issue for the Chinese foreign policy. And of course, there's the waves of the claim of compensation from China. China needs to deal with that. And China also needs to provide a satisfactory explanation to the Chinese people that how Beijing has been defending China's name or China's reputation internationally. So there's a very strong logic, well, whether it's logical or not, there's a very strong argument in China that if the external environment has turned sour, and the United States has been leading these campaigns to attack China on every single aspect, COVID-19 being on the top of it. So regardless of how China tried to keep a low profile or how China could try to mend ties with the rest of the world, the substantive progress of that effort is not going to be there. Because unless, according to the Chinese logic, unless China basically does what US wants China to do, to abandon the high-tech industry, to abandon its industrial the defense modernization, and say yes to Washington, US is not going to stop charging China with all these crimes. So, but that kind of compromise or that kind of a conciliatory position is certainly not in the interest of the Chinese top leaders or in the interest of the Chinese government. And that is to say that I think the Chinese believe that a compromise or concessions is not going to deter or stop the current US anti-China strategy. So in their calculation, if China is going to face humiliation in terms of its foreign relations and China does not respond assertively to the accusations, then the pride or the legitimacy that they have gathered among the Chinese people will be eroded. And I think that is the fundamental reason why the wolf warrior diplomacy of China is going to escalate after the two sessions and after the COVID-19 instead of de-escalate. I'll stop there and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Steve.
That's terrific, both of you. It's just wonderful. What did you make in Li Keqiang's report? He in his work report, he said we should look. We should investigate the origins of COVID-19. So he explicitly said we should do that.
Yeah, and obviously General Secretary Xi Jinping said something similar when he spoke to WHO. I hate to be cynical about this, but he's not saying let's have an investigation centered around Wuhan to find out if the virus originated there. Well, what they want to do, and this the smart move, is to initiate a process, as Xi Jinping himself said, let's have this be global. Let's have this be led by the WHO. In other words, let's have this take a long time. And as Xi Jinping himself said, this is going to be a summing up. This is going to be a lessons learned. This is going to be a what worked, what didn't. So I think this is just absolutely brilliant of say, yeah, let's do an investigation. I'll set the rules of WHO. Let's just have it take a long time. We'll have lots of committees. I think that's really smart. What that won't do and what that's not intended to do is to be a very laser-like investigation of exactly what is the origin of this. And they've said this consistently, which is, look, the time for that is once we're through this. And again, which is very, very smart to me. Of course, every plot of every pandemic movie is always about racing to find the origin right away. So if China was ever making that movie, it would be quite boring because it would be mostly international committees. But nonetheless, I think we should be careful when they make statements like this. They're being I think they're being very clear and smart about what they're trying to do and they're not trying to do. And they're not trying to invite an investigation of boots on the ground from the US and other actors to be mucking around in Wuhan to find out if this originated there. But I'm cynical, but that's my interpretation.
Sonia?
Yes, Steve. So there are at least 5 caveats to the Chinese proposal or the Chinese way of defining this investigation. So the first one is a name. Instead of international investigation, the effort, according to the Chinese Foreign Ministry, will be named the Review Commission, greatly altering its purpose and reducing its severity. Second caveat is the timing. Like Jude said, the review can only happen after the COVID-19 is over, ruling out any near-term actions. Third caveat is the authorization. So according to the Chinese, the review will have to be authorized by WHO or its executive committee, basically giving China control through the China-friendly countries at WHO. The fourth caveat is the composition of the review commission. The Chinese already said the review commission can only be organized by the Director General of WHO, who we know is a very China-friendly figure, and I think he will ensure at least a China-neutral composition. And the last caveat is the coverage. The Chinese says the review commission will review the global response to COVID-19 rather than that of China. So it will not be about China's responsibility. It will be about how the world.
In addition to that of China, not rather than, right? It's
well,
not saying they're not welcoming the investigation in China.
Well, they said it's a global response, so it will include China, but also everybody else.
Any sign of dissent at this, either the CPC? I noticed the vote on Hong Kong had 1 negative and 6 abstentions, and 1 person forgot to push the button.
Well, no, you don't want to make it look rigged, Steve. You've got to have the you got to have the appearance of an open vote. Just on the dissent issue, I think a couple thoughts here. One is this is the perennial position of a lot of sort of external China watchers, is kind of waiting for the moment when the sort of people take to the streets. I think what anger or pressure was building up against the Xi administration in January, early February, dissipated as soon as the countries around the world, but especially the United States, really started to openly flub and flounder in a response. And I think that really worked to the advantage of the Xi administration of basically saying, I think you got it bad here. Look at what happened over there. The second point, though, is in a system where you have such extraordinary levels of control designed specifically to dissipate, divide opposition and dissent, we should not confuse the absence of obvious dissent with its actual absence. And I think there is a lot of dissatisfaction in China, especially from what the leadership would call rightists, but we'd call liberals, who are really genuinely concerned about the direction that China is going under the Xi administration. Obviously, this started on the economic front with the failure to deliver on the third plenum in 2013, but this has now grown into, I think more broadly, just folks who looked at the Deng legacy and where China was headed in terms of its domestic politics and an economic policy, and are seeing in Xi Jinping a real hardliner who is looking to undo or reverse many of those. And the problem is there's just not many avenues for expressing that dissent anymore. It used to have some platforms like the magazine Yanhuang Chunqiu, but those have all been obliterated. But I think let's not both expect that people will take to the streets anytime soon, but I also don't think we should expect everything is hunky-dory and Xi Jinping is widely loved by all the Chinese people just because we're not hearing these voices. The system is designed to sort of quash the avenues for those voices to be expressed.
Sonia?
Well, we know that Xi Jinping is not famous for democratic centralism, which was the collective leadership that the Chinese Communist Party had decided before him. So there are different views in China, and there are even among officials who disagree with this Wu warrior diplomacy. Like, for example, Steve, your best friend, your good friend, Ambassador Cui Tiankai, his reaction to, for example, the Wu warrior diplomacy has been very different from what we saw coming out of Beijing. But I think the key question is, are these views strong enough to really change the course that China has been on? And I think that gets to a conviction on Xi Jinping's part, which is that China needs a strong leader. China needs one voice. China needs one direction to proceed. because all these different views is only going to slow China down. So let's get it done. And then we can talk about whether we were successful. So we all know the danger of that. But unfortunately, I think that is a prevailing political culture in China today. And I don't see that being effectively challenged.
Can I just add just building on that? I think Xi Jinping's speech on May 23rd, there was a line that stuck out to me, which I think builds on what Sun Yun was just saying about the worldview that Xi Jinping inhabits and what he thinks needs to happen domestically in China to assure that the country continues to prosper but thrive. Is he said, I just pull up the quote here. He said, "We must seek development in a much more unstable and uncertain world." And you've seen similar comments like that from Xi Jinping over the past couple of years, basically saying, look, things are getting really nasty out there. I think obviously the position of the Trump administration on China has only helped confirm a pre-existing view from Xi Jinping. He's got a very, I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, he's got a very cynical, realist view of power and of international relations. And I think he is essentially saying, look, the next couple of years are going to be very, very hard for China. We're going to face a lot of not only external pressure, but also hostile foreign forces in Hong Kong, in areas of our periphery in Xinjiang. And so it's really time we tighten down now. And I think that includes, to what Yun was just saying on channels of dissent, but even within the senior leadership, we're going to allow some disagreement. And you're right, you do see some policy disagreements. You've seen it relatively recently over qualitative easing. So you've seen these debates. I wouldn't call them dissent, though. I would call them a sort of a bounds of debate that are permissible under Xi Jinping. And he wants some amount of that, just to hear a few different ideas. But I think he's really firm in his conviction on what needs to be done. And I think a tough policy by the US has really been an accelerant for Xi Jinping's worldview, and basically says, see guys, I told you, they wanted to contain us.
Yeah, one might argue accelerant or cause. In other words, the way the administration talks about China, so just taking a small example would be the claim that after they shut down Wuhan, they allowed flights to the United States, with the secretary insinuating this was deliberate attempt to infect the American population. There is just no data that support. It's just a lie by our administration. It's a lie by the US government. It puts the Chinese government in a position of having to respond in a way that they kind of go, what do we do? This is just, they'll tweet and make up things about what we're doing, not to excuse the other things that the Chinese government does. But when the US government just outright lies about it and tries to perpetuate these falsehoods, even today, President Trump said, no, they kept letting Chinese fly elsewhere. Well, no, that has been proved. We looked at the flight data. It's not true. So what should the Chinese do?
But yeah, I mean, I think we got to walk and chew gum at the same time. I think we can sit here and say the way that the Trump administration, but Trump in particular, and Secretary of State Pompeo, we can have a very long discussion about our problems we have with them and their response and where it's leading the U.S. At the same time, I think we've got to be brutally honest about what's happening in China. And there, I have to say, this more aggressive posture from Beijing didn't start in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. And I'm not pretending that we're innocent. This is a dynamic, complex equation here. But I think, Beijing is it's been for well over a decade moving in a much harder trajectory that is including a domestic crackdown. So it's not just about a posture vis-a-vis the United States. They have no tolerance for Chinese articulating a different direction that they want the country to go. So I think, personally, this predates Donald Trump. I think we can agree that the Trump administration, to me, has been an accelerant on this and maybe a cause to some extent. But I don't think this is just Beijing innocently, sitting there and reacting to the Trump administration. So I think we can, I hope we can do both at the same time, which is call out the United States for where it is misrepresenting, lying, working against the interests of long-term US security and prosperity, but at the same time, really be shocked by the direction that a hardline administration under Xi Jinping is taking the country.
Sun Yun.
Yes, sir. I think I would agree with Jude. I think both superpowers, both great powers have come out of this pandemic short of leadership, and both of them have come out of the pandemic probably as losers in terms of their soft power, their international credibility. I think the U.S. certainly was not fair when it finger points China as a sole reason or the only cause of the damage that the pandemic has created in the United States. I think China needs to carry its responsibility. But I think also the U.S. internal failure to counter the pandemic effectively, that one is not on China. Yeah. So I think coming to what can be done, I have this interesting conversation with a Chinese where I quoted Michelle Obama. So she used to say, when they go low, we go high, right? But what we are seeing currently between US and China is that when they go low, we all go low. Actually, we need to go lower. So we are witnessing a downward spiral of US and China competing for which country can discard more rules or can discard more laws. So, and that has created a lot of difficulty. I'm sure you have too, in the dialogues that we're trying to host between US and China. It's so difficult to avoid the finger pointing because there's just so many things that either side could finger point the other side. So how to jump out of that vicious circle or that cycle, I think that's really a key question. So maybe the one way to look at it, which is very difficult, I reckon, is from conflict mediation or conflict resolution. It's the ability to ask a question that instead of finger pointing the other side, what our side can do to make the relationship better, what we can do to improve the relationship. So if either side or both sides would have the heart to do that, I think that will open up some room for constructive dialogues.
Jude, also, Sun Yun raises a great question about how do we get, downward spiral is the exact right term. How do we break the spiral? How do we put a floor underneath? Every morning I kind of get up and the floor is falling away and it's gotten worse and worse and worse. How do we put a floor under it?
I'm just trying to be realistic about the kind of the dynamics over the next 3 to 6 months through an election. It's really, I think I'm going to dodge the question, Steve, by doing what they do on a talk show where you say that's an interesting question, but I think the more important question we need to ask. No, I don't know, because both sides now think they are in the stronger position, and I think both sides are convinced of their righteousness for different reasons. I mean, I think Sun Yun just outlined really well Beijing's thinking about this I think Beijing's wrong, but nonetheless the thinking of this, which is, look, it's damned if we do, damned if we don't. So what the heck? The U.S. has been hell-bent on containment for a long time. They kept it quiet. They denied it. Now they're at least being explicit in saying it. So I think that logic makes sense. And so Beijing's not looking to move because it says, look, we've been getting screwed for a long time. But crucially now, I think Beijing assesses that its composite national power, its strength is such that it no longer needs to cower in the corner like it did 15 years ago. So that's one equation. Then the other is you've got, and this isn't just the Trump administration, I have to say. I think the Trump administration is reflecting or drawing strength from broad dissatisfaction in the US with globalization and the inability of globalization, maybe by design, to not distribute benefits more evenly. And so if the system isn't working, what the heck? I think COVID-19 and also the MBA controversy last year took the China issue, which was relatively wonky and within think tanks, and really injected it into the mainstream in ways that I think are hard to shake. I think there's a real populist anger, whipped up to be sure, but I don't think it's entirely fabricated. I think there's some sort of grassroots organic element of this. Sprinkle onto that an election season. I think that's a really dangerous cocktail. And to try and answer it, what can shift, and maybe merging with Sun Yun's comment on conflict mediation or resolution, what we can't control Beijing in a sense that domestic politics in Beijing are operating, all politics are local. We can compete with them internationally, but really, and this is a cliche, but that really gets back to what are some of the enduring strengths that the United States can do, which is, I think we sit in a vastly superior position in terms of the effectiveness of our international position, our soft power, our ability to lead. I think when the United States starts getting on its front feet again, and instead of walking away like we did today from the WHO, I was just made that comment that Trump said, like, they basically bought off the WHO for 1/10 the money we did. And I thought, so you're saying openly that they're just much smarter at playing the game than we are. There's a lesson in that. I think that's true. And that shows that we're just not actively leading, engaging, but crucially to me, and this is kind of my big unified theory of why US-China relations are so bad right now. It's not about Trump. It's not about Xi Jinping. It's about the breakdown of an institutional order that did very well from 1945 until 2008. But what we stopped doing is investing and innovating in international governance institutions. And so we're now taking 20th century institutions like the WTO and expecting them to solve 21st century problems and challenges. And so we need to sort of take the lead and say, we're going to have a new Bretton Woods agreement. We're going to have a sort of a new conversation about, we've got a host of new challenges created by technology, by new patterns of globalization, by income inequality, things we didn't have 50 or 60 years ago. And we're going to start building and designing an institutional order that looks to sort of integrate safely balancing national security, rather than what we're doing now is we're taking our roll of duct tape and we're going to all these institutions and trying to wrap the duct tape around them to keep them working. And it's that institutional inadequacy, to me, which is leading to the breakdown in US-China relations. Because if WTO isn't working, well, then screw it. We just start levying tariffs left and right. And that's what's driving this.
I'll give a commercial to the other institution that you're affiliated with, CNAS. That CNAS with Eli Ratner wrote a report on how the United States needs to deal with the competition with China. And a lot of it is about investing, what we should be investing in the United States, kind of exactly what you're talking about. And if you have a tolerance for an hour and 15-minute recording, I think that recording is on the National Committee's website. Sun-Yun, in normal years, the passage of a new civil law, this, I think it's 1,800 articles, would be a front page news. It's barely received mention in the Western press. It does things like provides civil penalties for sexual harassment. It has something, it gives a right to die with dignity. Kind of as a lapsed lawyer, I've been listening to conversation descriptions from presented by some of the drafters of that law, which are on the internet, and you can listen to. Anything we should know about that?
Well, like you said, it's an extremely long document. I've read some of the summaries of it, but I have not read the whole thing through yet. So I'm afraid that the knowledge that I can offer on that is pretty limited. But I think if you look at the directions that the civil law is pointing towards, I think it still represents an incremental, although very slow, progress of the Chinese society, right? So the things that you have just mentioned, that they represent the direction that we do want to see China going in. But it's just the Chinese history is never just from point A to point B. There's surely regression, a lot of regressions, and followed by some progression. So it depends on the perspective that we take. And that gets back to the comments that Jude was making. Where are we going with the US-China relations? I think there are two versions, two scenarios, one short-term, one long-term, that they might sound as bad news, but eventually there might be some good news if I can be a little optimistic. In terms of the short view, we could say that, well, this is the election year. And because of Trump administration's re-election campaign has been severely interrupted and disrupted by the COVID-19, there are some moves, there are certain developments that we otherwise would not normally see without COVID-19. So if you adopt that logic, then that means that, well, after the election, we probably will have some stability because the pressure imposed by the re-election campaign has been tremendous on the Trump administration. So, like, for example, when we look at the sanctions that he announced on Hong Kong today, he did not really touch the phase one trade deal, right? And I think that's one signature, one sign. And the other scenario is when we look at the long term. Well, this is not about party politics. I agree with Jude. It's not just about Republicans or Democrats. It's about the fundamental problem in the international system. Then in that sense, I'm afraid that things will have to get worse before they get better, which means that US and China are now mutually probing each other's bottom lines. They're both attempting to see where the red line really is to stop the other side. And what that means is that the two sides will have to come to the brinks of something very dangerous before they can sit back and reconsider what is the consequences of our current behavior. So that might sound terrible, that might sound bad, but maybe that will be what it takes for the two countries to come up with some basic bottom lines and the rules of engagement. Thank you.
Yep. We have a who's who of U.S.-China relations as our audience today, so let me get to the questions. Deborah Seligson asks, how do you think the removal of the GDP target affects all the other targets in the 13th five-year plan? Do you think they will continue for the next year, or are local officials assuming they'll get a pass on all hard targets?
That's a really great question, and one I can expect of that sophistication from Deborah. So I think that's a great question. This is just spitballing. My sense in just all the discourse that was surrounding the removal of the growth target was saying that you're basically getting a pass this year so long as the actions you're taking are about stability, economic stability and employment. So I think I haven't seen anything technically that has said we're going to have a knock-on effect on all other subsidiary targets, but my sense is the spirit of this is we've got an economic and unemployment problem. So we're basically going to give pretty significant latitude to lower level officials to find the bottom, put a foundation under it. And of course, we know the 13th five-year plan is coming up for expiration this year. So it'll be interesting to see when we have the next five-year plan, we'll see drafts of it later this year, if they have now moved towards a more permanence, or at least some sort of now hybrid model of some fixed targets for officials, but actually removing some of those. And what this may be the kind of exogenous shock, well, I guess endogenous, depending on what the investigation says, but the endogenous shock in COVID-19 may be the sort of thing that is needed to allow the government to walk away from a lot of these targets without, in a sense, admitting that they are failing. But great question.
So you want to know? One of your PIP fellows, Isaac Carden, one of your other fellows, asked, there's been a sharp debate of late on the degree to which official communications from the PRC should be considered reliable signals of intention and reasonable predictions of future action versus cheap talk with little relationship to intention or action. Where do you come down on this when analyzing the Liang Hui, or even in general? So
I can weigh in, but I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this.
Sure. I think the official communications in China, we always have the question that right? Are they bluffing, or is it just propaganda? I think yearly the Chinese official communication, at least from the foreign policy point of view, represents some bottom line truths that the Chinese are trying to achieve. But it doesn't mean that they don't revise their goals when they realize that their official statements or official positions encounter problems or pushbacks. So I would say that the Chinese do treat official communications as somewhat a fog of war, that there are certain elements of propaganda and also bluffing coming to foreign policy and security policy, but it also reflects a certain level of the genuine position on their part. But Jude might have different ideas.
No, I think that's spot on. And of course, Isaac's referring to a Twitter debate on this issue. For those who are wondering where the cheap talk phrase came from. Of course, the point is it really depends on the document. So in the case of the government work report, of course they know when they're writing that external audiences are reading that, but that's primarily a signaling mechanism for lower level officials. So this is not a blanket statement you can take of are government documents cheap talk? You've got to do some grunt work, which is, what is the document? What is the venue? Who's delivering it, right? And you begin to tease out, like the 19th Party Congress speech that Xi Jinping gave, has a range of audiences there. And so this is this is the hard work of doing analysis. So I think, like when the State of the Union address here in the United States, like that specific venue has intended audiences, and that's the work that we have to do. So there's no generic thing, it's cheap talk for me. It really depends. When Xi Jinping goes and gives a speech at Davos, and sorry, Steve, to say this, that's cheap talk to me. That's a pure foreign audience, and they know we lap it up. It's when it's in Chinese, and a speech at a plenum, that's the stuff I think is there's where the real good stuff is.
Tom Gold asks at Berkeley, can Jude and Yun try to put themselves in the shoes of China's leaders? How can they make sense of American policy, foreign and domestic, especially when most of us, I dare say, have no idea what's going on? How can they formulate foreign policy to anticipate American action and reaction? Also, please comment on how Beijing's Taiwan policy fits into the general line and tone of the Lianghui.
I think the Chinese can't. They ask Americans this question. I'm sure they ask Steve, they ask Jude, they ask me, they ask Trump that how do we really make sense of Trump's policy? And there's not very good answer from the American side either. So I think that probably reinforces the message to the Chinese that, well, we cannot predict what the US will do. So the only thing we can focus is on what we can do. So I think that adds to the momentum in Beijing that we need to take charge. We need to take the initiative. We need to not be surprise attacked by the Trump administration. We also need to come up with our own policies to assert our own positions instead of waiting for them to attack us. So I think this inability to really gauge where the Trump administration will go has strengthened the momentum in China to pursue the goals that they see as their important goals. And I think Taiwan is one of those issues. On Lianghui, people paid a lot of attention to the fact that Li Keqiang's work report did not mention 92 consensus, and he did not mention peaceful in terms of the reference to unification. He only used the term promote unification, and that raises a lot of questions. But then, of course, in his press conference he hosted yesterday, he added those two terms back to the government narrative.
Is that because there was a lot of pushback?
I think there was.
I was in the Zhang Yesui's press conference. He didn't use peaceful, and I was watching it. And I was quite shocked. In fact, I had to rewind the television, and then the work report didn't have it, and then suddenly it's back in. What happened?
There were a lot of speculations about whether this really signals China dropping peaceful unification as the formula for the solution of the Taiwan issue. And I think there are strong voices in China. I'm sure, Steve, you know this. There are very strong voices in China calling for the central government to revise that doctrine, to revise peaceful unification as the only solution, as the preferred solution to the Taiwan issue. But I think the government is still jumping back and forth to determine whether they are ready to make such a drastic move. I think they do want to send signals to both DPP government and to the Americans that our patience is running thin. And there are more and more people in China who believe that unification cannot be achieved without the use of force. So I think they're flirting with the idea, they're testing the water with the idea, but I think it's primarily a deterrence message instead of a preparatory message. Thank you.
Jude, anything on that?
No.
Mike Lampton. So the U.S. adopts a punitive policy regarding Hong Kong. What support can Washington expect from its allies? Well,
so the EU foreign ministers have met today and have talked about preferring dialogue. So probably from the EU foreign ministers, not much. If the Trump administration was expecting them to sign on. The UK there's an interesting discussion going on there. There's you saw Zhao Lijian, the MFA, firing back at the UK government today because they have talked about at least offering a path to citizenship for I think upwards of 3 million who hold these special identities as British residents overseas. So Beijing has said if these are Chinese nationals, if you offer them passports, you'll be in trouble. But nonetheless, I think the discussion is interesting in the UK. But a limitation of a go at it alone strategy in general by the U.S. is when you're trying to pull people onto your side, it can be difficult. I don't think until we see exactly what the package that comes out, it'll be difficult for folks to sign on. But this is clearly a moment where the U.S. was well poised to lead an international pushback, because there is across the board frustration and concern about Beijing's moves here. So this could have been a great, and maybe it still could be, a moment where the U.S. could rally some support behind something meaningful. The problems now are, and I'll stop after this, but the problems now are the tool set the United States is talking about using are as you know, Mike said, are punitive towards Beijing, and it's not clear to me what we get for Hong Kong out of this, but more importantly, just cynically, what we get for the United States in terms of our long-term strategic competition against China on this. So the two things that should matter most, Hong Kong and our competition and our rivalry with China and being strategic about this, I don't see both of those there. And so, of course, it's hard to enlist support in that environment.
So, Nguyen, anything on that? What did you make of this, what seemed quite a reasonable statement issued by the Canadian, Australian, American, and UK governments, which seemed actually, yeah, made some sense about Hong Kong? Did you see that?
Yeah. I did. Well, I was going to pull up the exact quote. I was just reading it earlier today. So, so I know that they had, after the statement, after they put it out, they tried to get the EU to sign on to it, and the EU said, no, we're fine, thank you. But yeah, no, I thought that was a very good statement. So Australia, Britain, US, Canada said that China's moves are, quote, in direct conflict with its international obligations. So that's obviously, those sorts of statements, I think, are obviously the good first step. But it really, it's now about what the next step is, and the U.S. has chosen a course of action. I'm just worried about what it won't get us. Anyway, but I've already made that point, so I won't just make it again.
Yeah, I would just add that in terms of that statement, my worry is that that might be the most that U.S. can get its allies to do. If you look at Australia's relationship with China, there's a trade war pending. And looking at Canada, the Chinese Foreign Ministry just called Canada as an accomplice of the U.S. yesterday, well, actually earlier today. So I think there are plenty of friends that China are currently having a battle with both Australia and Canada and UK. So I think the U.S. ability to enlist the support from the allies on those fronts are going to be difficult.
But really, if we don't work with our allies, whether it's on trade issues, security issues, or others, aren't the policies doomed to failure? I mean, I saw President Trump made reference to this requirement that will soon put in place, which will delist Chinese companies if they don't comply with certain audit requirements, which is something which is probably the right policy, except if Hong Kong, Singapore, Tokyo, and London don't agree to it, they just move there, and it doesn't make any difference. But it's the same concept that applies to virtually every sector, that if we don't do it with our allies, export controls, what are we doing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. It's just, how many times have we made that statement? I mean, it just, working with our allies has become something of a cliche at this point, because we just say it's. But I think, look, even if you really want to take a tough line on China, even if, which I do. I mean, I think long-term competition with China is arguably our single most important component of our foreign policy. On that side of it, though, allies are not sort of a distraction or an annoyance. They're a central part of that. And so even the tough on China side of this requires that we have a well-coordinated, calibrated alliance strategy, even if we recognize that there are going to be significant areas where we don't agree with the UK or with Germany or with the EU or with Canada. That's natural and inevitable. But we have, at this current moment, relative disdain for alliances and for allies. We see them as baggage and as burden, except when we want them to sign on for something, and then we get really angry when they don't. But I think this shows your point is, especially on economic statecraft, it's impossible to do this without working in a coordinated fashion. Because as you say, a lot of these, there's such slippage and leakage possible for where capital and companies move, that if you don't have a wide net to try and coordinate, then it's relatively ineffective. So I totally agree.
Yeah.
Well, I think US will have to develop some realistic expectations as for what the allies will deliver. US, we are in a great power competition with China. So this is a competition for supremacy. This is a competition for global leadership or even global dominance in a way. But European countries are not. And Canada is certainly not in a great power competition with China. So there are certain issues I think allies will be on the same side with US. For example, the Chinese human rights record or China's ideological push globally. I think those are the issues that allies will be on our side. But if we demand European allies to be on our side in order for US to win the great power competition with China, I think our allies also have their own interest to take into consideration, because they are not in this competition with China.
But my point is, if we take these actions unilaterally, they are self-defeating. So investment restrictions, if we have those investment restrictions because of this great power competition, Europe, Japan, Korea, ASEAN don't have it. What are we doing? We're just taking capital away from the United States, taking jobs away from the United States and putting it in those places. Export controls. If goods can be produced in the EU, Japan, Korea, like a lot of chips, and we're restricting US companies, we're just punishing ourselves. It's policies that, even if, I think as Jude said, you want to get tough on China, doing it yourself is pointless. In fact, it's worse than pointless. It's counterproductive. It ends up hurting Americans. Who said Americans need to be willing to pay a price for this competition. Need to be willing to pay a price. You tell it to the machinist. You tell it to the dock worker. You look them in the eye and you say, you got to pay this price. I don't think they want to pay that price, but let me go to another question. Tom Kehoe from Kingsbridge Strategies. Defense Minister Wei Fenghe, I assume this was at the Lianghui, made some very aggressive remarks this week about Sino-American relations being at high risk. Is this saber rattling or comments to be worried about?
I think this is in line with the general perception of the deterioration of external relations for China since the beginning of the COVID-19. I think this echoes China's developed position on DPP, on Tsai Ing-wen's pro-independence policy in Taiwan. So I think the PLA has been mobilized or has been instructed to be prepared for potential events that will require their service to defend the country. I don't think that's it's just a warning message. I think they literally see this as a bottom line issue, and they literally see the need to be prepared militarily.
Jude?
Yeah, I mean, so just putting our hats on as trying to be intellectually empathetic to what the other side is saying, it would be a dereliction of duty if the PLA wasn't seeing an escalation occurring right now in the U.S.-China relations. So I think the saber rattling, I saw this less as a threat to the United States, although of course they understand their messages, how it's interpreted. But I think this is more, he basically said, look, we got to buck up our fighting spirit. We have to prepare for, and we have to prepare for increased instability and tension in the relationship. On that simple statement, I think that's an accurate diagnosis of where the relationship is right now. So one of the things I'll I notice now that as escalations are increasing, people are pulling out select comments from various sides and from various mediums and holding these up as saying, you know, the Chinese government said X when it may have been the English language edition of the Global Times. And I'm not saying we ignore the English language edition of the Global Times, but I think this is where the ability to contextualize where statements are coming from, where they're directed, to this cheap talk argument earlier, is going to be so important, because we have to interpret differently an English language Global Times editorial than we do a speech by Xi Jinping. And I think it could be very dangerous, especially in a social media era where a statement can be pulled out. I remember last year there was someone was running a clip from someone in the PLA talking about putting boots on the ground in Hong Kong, and it was sort of made to seem like this was a live yesterday comment, and turns out it was from kind of, I forget the context of it, it was 10 years ago. And but of course, in this, you know, in this environment, a lot of these things we've got a lot of gasoline around, and a lot of these statements are matches. So I'm not trying to, I think there was a great question asked. It was just the contextualizing this is going to become so important, because the temperature can be raised very, very quickly if we don't have an accurate calibration of what the message was intended to do.
We have sadly run out of time, but this has been a fabulous, fabulous discussion. And you have simply convinced us once again how great the PIP program is, that we were brilliant enough to select both of you, and that both of you were fulfilling the vision of the PIP program, that's our Public Intellectuals program, which is to further rational discussions about China and US-China relations. And you are both terrific for giving of your time. Thank you so much. And I see the audience remained unchanged the whole time. So clearly you were—
They're all checking their email or on Twitter. I do the same thing.
You had them mesmerized. You had them mesmerized. But everybody have a great weekend. Stay safe. And we look forward to seeing you next week. And thanks again, Jude.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Bye.